A thin veil of mist clung to the frozen lawns of the Ashford estate as dawn crept reluctantly over London. The year was 1850, and the city stirred beneath a hush of snow and expectation. Within the grand townhouse on Grosvenor Square, Lady Eleanor Whitmore Ashford sat by her dressing-table, watching her maid pin a final strand of hair into place. The mirror reflected a woman of elegance, pale, composed, and almost painfully calm, but her eyes betrayed a stillness that came not from peace, but from endurance. 3 years of marriage had taught her many things: how to smile without meaning it, how to listen without hearing, and how to live beside a man whose affection was as remote as the stars beyond her window. Her husband, Lord Henry Ashford, was everything society revered and she quietly feared. In Parliament, his voice carried weight; in salons and clubs, his name commanded respect. Yet in the private sphere of marriage, he was a figure of absence, polite, restrained, and unfathomably distant. Their union, arranged with the precision of a business contract, had been forged to merge 2 noble lineages. Eleanor had entered it with the obedience expected of her class, and Henry with the sense of duty expected of his station. The result was a life of quiet civility, their shared home more museum than marriage. That evening they were to attend the Duchess of Devonshire's winter ball, an event that marked the highlight of the season, a night of glittering finery where every glance and whisper carried consequence. Eleanor dreaded it. The previous year's gossip still lingered like perfume that refused to fade, that the young Lady Ashford, though beautiful, was unloved, that her husband preferred his business affairs and political clubs to her company, that theirs was a match without warmth. None of it was spoken to her face, of course. In London society, cruelty dressed itself in courtesy. By the time the carriage rolled through the gaslit streets, Eleanor had arranged her features into the serene composure expected of a countess. She wore a gown of ivory silk trimmed with silver thread, a vision of grace, though her heart felt heavy beneath the weight of it. Henry sat opposite her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. They exchanged the smallest of courtesies: the temperature, the lateness of the hour, the Duchess's fondness for excessive ornamentation. Words floated between them like snowflakes, cold and fleeting. When the carriage stopped before the grand marble steps, he offered his arm as convention required. She took it because duty demanded it. The ballroom shimmered with light and laughter. Crystal chandeliers dripped brilliance from the ceiling, violins sang, and hundreds of candles transformed the hall into a world of gold and shadow. Eleanor moved among the guests with practiced poise, acknowledging greetings, enduring compliments, and concealing the fatigue of a heart long denied tenderness. She felt eyes upon her, assessing, sympathetic, sometimes envious. She could almost hear the murmurs that followed her passage. How beautiful she looked, how fortunate she was, how pitiable her solitude must be. Near the orchestra, a cluster of ladies whispered behind their fans. Their conversation, soft as lace, floated toward her. "Such a pity, isn't it? He leaves her alone at every gathering. They say Lord Ashford spends more time at his club than in his own home." Eleanor's gloved hand tightened on her fan, the motion small but sharp. She turned away, her smile never faltering. In a room where reputation was the only form of survival, silence was armor. Moments later, Henry arrived, late as always. He entered with the composed authority that marked him in every sphere, tall, austere, impeccably dressed in black and white. Conversation paused briefly as people inclined their heads in greeting. He acknowledged them with practiced grace, then crossed to where Eleanor stood. Their eyes met, a look that might have held warmth once, but now served merely as recognition. "Lady Ashford," he said quietly, bowing slightly. "My lord," she replied, dipping her head. For a fleeting instant, the orchestra's music softened, and she wished, absurdly, that he might take her hand and lead her to the dance floor. Instead, he gestured politely toward the refreshments and began a conversation with a fellow peer about trade reforms. She listened for a while, the words washing over her like the distant sound of rain, then excused herself and wandered toward the balcony. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, filled with the faint scent of snow. The gardens below glowed with frost, the moon tracing silver patterns on the hedges. Eleanor drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders and let the chill bite her skin, a sensation more honest than the warmth inside. Behind her, laughter drifted through the doors, muffled and insincere. She thought of the girl she had been 3 years ago, hopeful, obedient, easily charmed by the grandeur of a name. The wedding had been magnificent, the vows solemn, the future assured. Yet what use was splendor without companionship? What meaning had devotion when it was not returned? In that moment, she realized how quietly a heart could break without a sound, how loneliness could exist even in rooms filled with people. A sudden voice interrupted her reverie. "It is bitterly cold out here, Lady Ashford. You should not risk the air." Henry stood in the doorway, his tone courteous but distant. "The cold is preferable to the conversation," she answered, her voice calm but edged with quiet defiance. He hesitated, as if uncertain whether to be offended or impressed. "Society can be tedious," he said finally, "but appearances must be kept." "Yes," she murmured, meeting his gaze. "Appearances." For a heartbeat, something flickered in his expression, a trace of regret, swiftly buried. Then he inclined his head. "Shall I fetch your carriage?" "I believe the night is still young," she replied. They stood in silence, the distance between them more profound than any argument. The wind lifted a strand of her hair, brushing it across her cheek. He watched her, perhaps wanting to speak, perhaps too proud to begin. Then he turned and left, his footsteps fading into the hum of the ballroom. When Eleanor finally re-entered, the gossip resumed like a tide. She moved through it with grace, but her spirit felt brittle, like glass too long under pressure. At midnight, the Duchess's toast rang through the hall, and couples raised their glasses to the coming year. Henry stood across the room, his profile illuminated by candlelight. Their eyes met briefly, then drifted apart. By the time the last carriage departed, the ballroom lay quiet, the laughter gone, the candles dimming. Eleanor stepped into the cold night air once more, her breath visible against the darkness. In her hand, she still held the fan she had carried all evening, its ivory edge cracked, unnoticed until now. Back at the Ashford townhouse, the silence of their shared life settled around her like snow. She removed her jewelry, each motion deliberate, each breath steady. When she reached her vanity, she found an envelope placed neatly beside the mirror, the royal crest pressed in wax. A formal invitation, addressed to both Lord and Lady Ashford. The Queen's grand New Year's Eve ball. Eleanor studied it for a long moment, her reflection meeting her gaze in the mirror. Somewhere deep within that stillness stirred a feeling she had not allowed herself in years. Not hope, not yet, but the faint remembrance of what it felt like to want something more than duty. She blew out the last candle, and let the darkness take the room. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and relentless, covering all traces of what the night had revealed. The days following the Duchess's ball unfolded beneath a sky of unbroken grey. London, draped in frost, moved at its usual brisk pace, carriages rattling over cobblestones, lamplighters bent beneath the weight of dusk. Within the Ashford townhouse, however, time seemed suspended, caught between civility and quiet sorrow. Lady Eleanor sat by the window of the morning room, a letter unopened in her lap. It was the Queen's invitation, its wax seal already broken by her husband and left wordlessly on the table between them the night before. They were expected to attend together, as they always did, as though affection could be performed through choreography. She turned the parchment in her hands, tracing the royal crest with her fingertip, and wondered if fate meant to test her patience or grant her a reprieve. That afternoon, as she walked through the snow-dusted streets of Mayfair to deliver blankets for the church charity, a small parcel arrived at the estate bearing her name. When she returned, her maid presented it with curiosity. It was wrapped in navy paper, tied with a silver ribbon. Inside lay a delicate silver locket, oval and gleaming, engraved simply with her initials, "Ye." No note accompanied it, no indication of sender. For a moment she thought it might have come from her father, whose affection remained her only constant comfort. Yet when she studied the ribbon again, something in the way it was tied, precise, symmetrical, stirred an odd familiarity. Henry's handwriting was neat in the same deliberate way. The thought unsettled her more than it pleased her. At dinner, she sought the courage to ask. The meal passed in practiced politeness. The sound of cutlery, the rustle of linen, the faint ticking of the mantel clock marking each unspoken thought. Henry seemed distracted, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the walls. Finally, she placed the locket on the table between them, its silver catching the light. "Was this from you?" she asked. Her voice was steady but gentle, like one testing the strength of ice. He looked at it briefly, then back to his plate. "I thought you might find it agreeable," he said, as though the gift were a matter of household maintenance. "It is beautiful," she replied softly, "but I do not understand why." Henry hesitated, the knife in his hand motionless. "It seemed an appropriate gesture," he said after a moment. "The Queen's ball approaches. It is customary for a husband to present his wife with something suitable." The answer was formal, detached, yet beneath the words lingered a faint tremor, as though even he knew how hollow they sounded. Eleanor said nothing more. When the meal ended, he rose, excused himself, and retreated to his study. She remained, the locket cold in her palm, wondering if gestures made from duty could still hold a trace of longing. The next morning brought fresh gossip, carried on the wind like ash. While visiting the church, Eleanor overheard two society women speaking near the altar. Their tones were hushed but laced with pleasure. "It seems Lord Ashford is to appear at the Queen's ball with a guest," one murmured. "A Mrs. Rowley, the widow of some colonel. Quite charming, they say." The other laughed softly. "And poor Lady Ashford? Always so composed. I wonder if she even notices." Eleanor kept her posture still, her gloves tightening around the small bundle she carried. She did not confront them. Such comments were beneath her dignity, and yet their sting lingered. On her walk home, the carriages rattled past without mercy, and she felt suddenly foolish beneath the gray sky, a woman draped in silk and silence, mocked by those who mistook her restraint for weakness. That evening, she entered the library in search of a book and found Henry there, seated before the fire. Papers were spread across the desk, letters, notes, and what appeared to be reports for Parliament. He looked up, startled, as though unused to her presence. "You work late," she said quietly. "There is much to be done before the recess." She hesitated. "And before the ball, I imagine." He set down his pen, studying her carefully. "You have heard something." "Only that your attendance is eagerly anticipated," she replied, a touch too composed. "Apparently, you are not expected to attend alone." Henry's jaw tightened. "You give credence to idle gossip?" "I give weight to consistency," she said evenly. 3 years of distance lends such whispers a certain plausibility. He rose, anger flickering just beneath the surface. "You believe me capable of public humiliation? Of parading some woman while you stand by?" Eleanor met his gaze. "I believe you capable of indifference, my lord. It is the one talent you have practiced flawlessly." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and fragile. For the first time in years, Henry looked uncertain, not wounded by insult but disarmed by truth. "Perhaps I have been unkind," he said at last, voice low. "But do not think I have been unfeeling." She wished to ask what he meant, but pride restrained her. "Good night, my lord," she said, and left before he could reply. Later, while preparing for bed, her maid, Anna, spoke timidly. "My lady, forgive me if I speak out of turn, but I thought you should know. His lordship has kept all the letters you wrote to your father during your first year here. The ones you thought were sent from the house. He never posted them, but he did not destroy them either." Eleanor turned sharply. "What did you say?" "In the bottom drawer of his study desk," Anna said softly. "I saw them once when dusting. Every one of them, still sealed." Eleanor dismissed her gently and sat alone before the dying fire. The revelation confused her. Those letters had been her only confidants in the early days of her marriage, filled with loneliness and questions she had never dared voice aloud. Why would he keep them? To control her? To understand her? Or simply because he could not bring himself to throw them away? The thought stirred something fragile in her, a suspicion that behind his silence lay not cruelty, but fear. The days dwindled swiftly toward the Queen's ball. London gleamed with festive preparation. Carriages newly polished, windows trimmed with holly, the scent of pine and smoke lingering in the air. On the eve of the event, Eleanor attended a charity auction at the Countess of Wexford's hall. There, amid conversation and music, she overheard another remark, this time from a gentleman mocking Henry's parliamentary failures. "A man so proud cannot see that his influence is fading," he sneered. Eleanor, without hesitation, turned to him. "My husband's influence," she said evenly, "is built upon integrity, something that never fades, even when popularity does." Her words, delivered with quiet conviction, silenced the circle. The gentleman stammered an apology. Eleanor inclined her head and departed. Unseen behind a column, Henry had witnessed the exchange. The faintest shift crossed his face, surprise, then something gentler, almost remorseful. That night, when she entered her room, the silver locket awaited her once again on the dressing table, its surface polished, now reflecting the glow of candlelight. She opened it for the first time and found inside a single pressed violet. The kind that grew along the terrace garden she once tended before indifference became habit. Her breath caught, not in joy but in the ache of possibility. Outside, snow began to fall again, heavier this time, cloaking London in white. The Queen's ball was but a night away, and for the first time in 3 years, Eleanor found herself waiting, not for approval, nor for gossip to fade, but for the chance, however fragile, to be seen. The night of the Queen's winter ball arrived beneath a velvet sky streaked with frost. London glittered as if heaven itself had spilled its stars upon the city. Carriages rattled through the streets like constellations in motion, and every window of Buckingham Palace shone with golden light. Within those walls, the air hummed with anticipation, and beneath its chandeliers, the most powerful figures of England gathered to toast the passing of 1 year and the promise of another. Lady Eleanor Ashford stood among them, her gown of pale blue silk shimmering faintly as she moved, her composure faultless. Yet beneath the calm exterior, her heart trembled with an unfamiliar mixture of fear and hope. It had been years since she had walked beside her husband as anything more than a formality. But tonight, something in the air felt altered, fragile, unpredictable, almost alive. Henry had offered her his arm when the carriage arrived, and though his expression remained reserved, there had been a fleeting warmth in the gesture, a courtesy that carried the ghost of affection. Now, as they stood amid the glittering assembly, she could feel his presence beside her like a pulse. He was elegant as ever, dark hair, sharp profile, the quiet authority that turned heads without effort, but there was weariness in his eyes, a shadow of thought that softened him. Lady Ashford, Lord Ashford, the Queen's chamberlain announced as they entered the grand ballroom. The music swelled, violins rising in a tender cascade. Henry bowed, Eleanor curtsied, and the crowd resumed its murmuring. They were the picture of grace, and yet the onlookers' curiosity lingered. To society they were an enigma, bound by vows but divided by silence. Whispers trailed them like perfume. Eleanor kept her chin high, her poise unbroken, though the scrutiny pricked her composure. Henry guided her through the crowd toward the refreshment. "You look beautiful tonight," he said quietly, his tone even, but sincere enough that she turned to study him. "Thank you," she replied, surprised by the softness in his voice. "You are kind to say so. I should have said it before," he murmured, almost to himself. Then, as if regretting the admission, he added, "Shall we dance?" The question startled her more than any compliment. For 3 years he had never asked. The orchestra began a waltz, a slow, romantic melody that rippled through the hall like memory. She hesitated, uncertain whether she wished to expose herself to the pity of the room or to the possibility of feeling too much. But something in his expression, not pride, not command, but quiet entreaty, compelled her to accept. As his hand found hers, a strange familiarity returned, as though her body remembered what her heart had long forgotten. They moved together, tentative at first, each testing the boundaries of forgiveness. The music rose, and the crowd faded until only the two of them seemed to exist beneath the chandeliers. Henry's hand at her waist was steady. His eyes, when they met hers, carried a depth she could not read. "You defended me," he said softly, his breath brushing her temple. "At Wexford's gathering. I heard of it. You were there. I was. And I saw a woman braver than I deserved." Eleanor's voice trembled. "Then why keep your distance, Henry? Why build a life of silence?" He looked away, his jaw tightening. "Because I mistook silence for strength. I believed distance would protect us both from disappointment. And did it?" He shook his head once, the smallest of gestures. "No. It only taught me how loneliness sounds in the echo of one's own house." Her steps faltered. He steadied her. The confession, though quiet, struck like thunder. Before she could answer, a voice interrupted, a gentleman of Henry's acquaintance, one prone to careless humor. "Lord Ashford, you surprise us. I was beginning to think you had forgotten how to dance with your own wife." The words drew laughter from nearby guests. Eleanor's face burned, but before the sting could deepen, Henry turned sharply, his tone cold as steel. "You mistake restraint for neglect, sir. I have never forgotten my wife, only failed to prove it." The laughter died at once. Henry's hand tightened slightly around hers, as he led her away from the circle of startled faces. They stepped into the palace garden, where the snow fell softly upon marble statues and frozen roses. The night air was crisp, the moonlight silvering every surface. For a long while neither spoke. The distant strains of the orchestra floated through the open doors, faint and sorrowful. Eleanor broke the silence first. "You humiliated me once by ignoring me. Tonight you defend me before all of London. Which man are you truly?" "The same," he said after a moment. "Only wiser, perhaps, and tired of my own cowardice." She turned toward him, searching his expression. "You call it cowardice? I married you because duty required it," he said quietly. "But I stayed away because love frightened me more than any obligation. You were so composed, so untouchable, I believed you could never feel for me what I felt for you." Her breath caught. "You felt something for me?" He gave a short, bitter laugh. "From the moment I first saw you. But I built walls instead of bridges, thinking pride would guard me from rejection." Eleanor's heart ached with the weight of what might have been. "All these years," she whispered, "we were strangers not by fate but by choice." "By my choice," he admitted. "And I regret it more than I can say." The garden was utterly still. Snowflakes drifted into her hair, melting against her skin. She watched him, this man who had been her husband in name but never in heart, and for the first time, she saw not the stoic Lord of Parliament, but a man uncertain and human, yearning for forgiveness he scarcely believed he deserved. "You kept my letters," she said softly. He looked startled. "You know of them. I was told. Why keep them if you never meant to read them?" He hesitated, his voice low. "Because I could not bear to destroy the only pieces of you that were honest. They were your truth, written when you thought no one would ever see. I did not read them, because I feared finding my name absent from your heart." Tears glistened in her eyes, though she did not let them fall. "Then you should know," she said gently, "that every line I wrote was an attempt to reach you." For a long moment, silence held them. Then he took her gloved hand, his touch hesitant. "Eleanor," he whispered, the sound of her name a confession in itself, "if I were to begin again, would you allow it?" She looked up at him, the faintest smile breaking through her restraint. "We cannot begin again, Henry. But perhaps we might begin at last." The clock inside struck midnight, its chime echoing through the gardens like a heartbeat. The crowd inside erupted in cheers, toasts, and laughter, but out beneath the falling snow, two people stood in stillness, as if time had chosen to pause for them alone. Henry brushed a stray snowflake from her cheek, his hand trembling slightly. She did not move away. For the first time since their vows were spoken, warmth passed between them, not through passion or promise, but through recognition. As the last chime faded, Eleanor glanced toward the palace, where the great windows blazed with light. "They will expect us back," she said softly. "Let them wait," Henry replied. When they finally returned, hand in hand, the whispers began anew, but neither heard them. Their silence was no longer an absence, it was a beginning. And yet, as dawn's first light touched the palace roof, a messenger waited by the Ashford carriage, holding a sealed letter bearing the mark of the crown, a summons that would test the fragile peace they had just found. The letter arrived with the dawn, its seal unbroken, its paper marked by the faint scent of wax and winter air. Lord Henry Ashford turned it over in his hand, as if it carried the weight of his entire past. The emblem of the crown gleamed faintly in the firelight, unmistakable, inescapable. Eleanor watched him from across the breakfast table, the morning sunlight casting a pale gold across her face. The silence between them was not the cold absence that had once haunted their marriage. It was now something delicate, uncertain, alive with the awareness of what had changed and what still might. Henry broke the seal at last, his expression unreadable as he unfolded the parchment. His eyes scanned the neat, royal script. A moment later, his jaw tightened, and the paper trembled slightly between his fingers. "It is a summons," he said finally. "From the Queen herself." Eleanor's cup paused midway to her lip. "The Queen. She wishes for me to take charge of a diplomatic commission in Vienna. It is to begin immediately. A matter of trade and alliance, or so it says." For a moment, the words hung suspended in the quiet room. Outside, the carriages of London rattled faintly through the fog, the world moving on while theirs seemed to hold its breath. "How long?" she asked, her voice steady despite the sudden ache in her chest. "Months, perhaps a year," he said softly. "It is an honor one cannot easily decline." Eleanor lowered her eyes. Honor, that old, unyielding word. The very chain that had bound their lives from the start. "And will you go?" He hesitated, then folded the letter with care, placing it on the table as though it were fragile. "Before last night I would not have questioned it. But now," his voice faltered, "now I find myself wondering whether duty must always come before happiness." She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw not the polished nobleman but the weary, conflicted man beneath. "You have always served the crown faithfully," she said gently. "To refuse now would bring you no peace." "And if I accept," he murmured, "what peace will remain between us?" Eleanor rose from her seat and crossed to the window. Beyond the glass, snowflakes drifted across the Ashford gardens, untouched and quiet. "Perhaps," she said after a moment, "this is not the end of what we began last night. Perhaps it is the test of it." Henry's gaze followed her. "You would have me leave, then? After everything we have just begun to mend?" "I would have you return," she said simply. "Not because duty calls, but because love gives you reason to." Her words, though softly spoken, struck him with the force of truth. He crossed the room and stood beside her. "Eleanor, I do not deserve such faith." "No," she said, turning to face him. "But you have it nonetheless." The following week passed in a haze of preparations. The house stirred with activity, letters written, trunks packed, servants moving briskly through the halls. Yet within that bustle, there were moments of stillness that felt almost sacred. Henry began to seek her company in the mornings, sharing coffee and quiet conversation before his carriage rounds. At night, they sat by the fire, no longer as strangers, but as two souls rediscovering the language of companionship. On the evening before his departure, the house stood silent beneath the snow. Eleanor found him in the study, gazing into the fire with a letter in hand, not the Queen's this time, but one of her own, written years ago and never sent. "I found this among the old correspondence," he said when she entered. "You wrote it after our second anniversary." Her cheeks colored faintly. "I remember. I never had the courage to send it." He unfolded it gently. "You do not look at me any more," he read softly, "and I do not know whether I miss your gaze or the man I thought you were." He looked up, eyes shadowed with remorse. "I was both, and neither. I let pride blind me to what was in front of me." Eleanor stepped closer, the warmth of the fire catching the pale silk of her gown. "Then look now," she said quietly. "See me as I am." He did. And in that long, unbroken gaze, years of restraint dissolved into something purer, not passion, not possession, but recognition. He reached for her hand, and she let him. "If I return," he whispered, "will you be waiting?" She smiled faintly, a single tear glistening though her voice remained composed. "I have waited for less certain hopes than that." At dawn, the carriage stood ready before the steps. The horses snorted in the cold air, their breath rising like smoke. The servants bowed, the trunks were loaded, and still, Henry lingered at the doorway. Eleanor stood beside him, her gloved hand resting lightly on his arm. "I will write," he promised. "Not as a lord, not as a husband of duty, but as a man who has at last learned what love requires." "And I shall write back," she said, her lips curving with quiet grace. "For I have learned what love forgives." He lifted her hand to his lips, his kiss reverent, restrained, the gesture of a man who had spent years learning how not to feel, and had finally surrendered. "Goodbye, my heart," he murmured. "Not goodbye," she whispered. "Until your return." The carriage rolled away, its wheels crunching through the snow. She stood upon the steps until the last sound faded into silence, her breath forming ghosts in the cold morning light. For a long while, she did not move. Then, turning back toward the great doors, she paused, her eyes falling upon the letter he had left upon the table, the one bearing the crown seal. Beneath it, in his hand, was a single line written hastily across the parchment. "For once, I will serve not out of duty, but out of love, and for her, I will return." Eleanor closed her eyes, the words echoing within her like a promise. The house behind her was still, the fire dying low, yet within her chest, something bright had been kindled, fragile, enduring, and alive. The long winter would pass, and the world would change, but love, at last, had found its voice between them.